Howdy my totally as always tubular gamers, and we're back for another ranking video, and it's another Sega ranking video. Today's is going to be on the Streets of Rage series. If you don't know the Streets of Rage series, well, you're in for a treat. It's a series of side-scrolling beat-em-ups centered around the efforts of several ex-police vigilantes trying to rid crime from a large American city. You end up fighting a bunch of other things, but you do be fighting on these streets. The original 3 games were developed and published by Sega for the Genesis in the 90s, with the second game being the fan favorite and considered one of the very best beat-em-ups of all time, and one of the best Genesis games of all time. After that third game, the series would go on a hiatus, like a serious hiatus. While there was some attempts to bring the game back, Streets of Rage never really came back for 26 years until Streets of Rage 4 by Dotemu. Yeah, 26 years is that's a pretty long time. But there's a reason it came back after so many years. Streets of Rage was absolutely beloved for its awesome beat-em-up action, its challenging gameplay, and its bumpin' soundtrack. The soundtrack to all of these games are great. And before we get any further, I just want to say that there is no bad Streets of Rage game. All of these games are at the very least good, some are just better than others. Now when it comes to Streets of Rage and myself, I was never a huge fan. I had actually never played 1 through 3 until I was making this video, but I did play 4 back when it came out a couple years ago and was very impressed by it. Obviously we're not going to be including any fan games here and one version of each game, but there are some really good fan versions of these games, I will say. And as always, like, share, sub. If you disagree with me, let me know in the comments, or let me know what your favorite Streets of Rage game is. Let's just get right into it. What do I think is the weakest of the Streets of Rage games? And so here in the number 5 spot we have the spin-off known as Streets of Kamurocho. Now if you don't know Streets of Kamurocho, I couldn't blame you, because this game was not available for a long time. It was only available on Steam by Sega for 2 days actually, October 17th to the 19th of 2020. It was during a Sega anniversary, and I saw it right there on the front page of Steam and went, oh hell yeah, and downloaded it instantly and, well, gave it a shot. The game is essentially a crossover of Streets of Rage and the Yakuza series. Now the Yakuza series I've done plenty of videos on my channel, you can check those out, I'll put some links all around the screen or whatever, but this basically molds the two. The game is basically Streets of Rage 2 with a Yakuza paint on it, so you play as Kiryu, Majima, or Ichiban, you go around beating up Yakuza thugs. It's some renditions of some of my favorite Yakuza tracks, but more 16-bit. And yeah, you just kind of beat the crap out of everything. You can even do it in 2-player, which is pretty great. Now, this is a pretty solid beat 'em up, but the reason it's at the bottom is for a couple of reasons. One, it's not widely available. If you didn't get it during those 2 or 3 days for the anniversary, I don't actually know how you're supposed to play this. And while the combat is pretty good since it's Streets of Rage 2 and it's fluid and it's fun and it's satisfying and the game is challenging, there's only one stage. Yeah, you only play through one stage. I mean, you can play through it as all 3 characters to try to get a little more out of it, but yeah, it's just one level. We're talking 15-20 minutes here at most. Obviously, the Streets of Rage games were never the longest games, but this is just ridiculous. At least the music's pretty nice, the graphics are nice, and again, it is a solid enough beat 'em up, but there's just not a lot to it, and that's why it's at the bottom of this list. But don't discount it. I love me the Yakuza crossover. I love anything Yakuza, and I think that Streets of Rage is the perfect crossover for Yakuza, and I hope that this could one day maybe be like a full game. Okay, so here we have the original Streets of Rage. Now, the original Streets of Rage, it obviously laid the foundation for the later games, but when comparing all of them, yeah, Streets of Rage 1 is a bit behind the other games. The game is still a pretty decent beat 'em up, but it feels definitely much more like an NES beat 'em up than a Sega Genesis beat 'em up, and Streets of Rage 2, 3, and 4 really just kind of destroy this game when comparing them, but it's still a decent, fun little game. It is a pretty basic beat 'em up that feels much more like Double Dragon or Final Fight rather than what Streets of Rage became. And you know, you just go down these streets beating the crap out of everything. You'll fight ninjas, punks, women, tons of crazy things. You can play as 3 different characters, Adam, Axel, or Blaze, and you go after Mr. X, who's taken over a criminal syndicate and is very, very corrupt and evil. You go through 8 different stages, and yeah, you just beat the absolute crap out of everything that can basically move. There's a bunch of bosses at the end of these stages too that will really test you. In fact, this is actually a pretty challenging game, but it's nowhere near as challenging as the later games. It still is a fun time. It really is a classic. When it comes to things I didn't like about Streets of Rage 1 though, there were a few things, like I don't think the controls have aged all that well, especially compared to the other games. They feel incredibly stiff, way more stiff than 2 and 3, and the Twin Ladies boss can just seriously get on out of here. This is just cheap as hell. And yeah, it's not going to break any barriers. This game isn't crazy. It's not one of the best beat 'em ups ever, and it does have a pretty good soundtrack. It's not an amazing soundtrack, at least I don't think so, but it is pretty alright, and oh, it's a fun little time. If you're gonna play all of the games, I'd say you might as well try the original, but other than that, you could probably skip this one. And so here we have Streets of Rage 3. Now, Streets of Rage 3 was very interesting for a number of reasons. They really had to build on top of Streets of Rage 2, which already had a great foundation, and they do a few things that I just don't think make it as good as Streets of Rage 2, but this is still a very good beat 'em up nonetheless. When it comes to the controls and the combat, I think it is just as good as Streets of Rage 2, if not better actually. It feels great, it's incredibly smooth, the combos are great to pull off, I love how many moves there are, I love how many characters there are, there's a bunch more characters, you can even unlock some, and a lot of the special moves are really fun to pull off, they no longer take up your health either. I really do like the combat of this game, and there are a lot of different enemies that you will encounter in this game. Sometimes so many enemies get on screen the game starts lagging and slowing down, which is always a fun time, but yeah, you just really beat the piss out of a bunch of different things in this game. The game tries to have a bit more of an in-depth story about Mr. X coming back after he's been defeated twice, but eventually I just kind of stopped paying attention, to be honest. But yeah, this game even includes cutscenes and in-game dialogue, which is interesting, I'll leave it at that. Something Streets of Rage 3 tries to do over the other ones is instead of having a bunch of different levels, they have much more in-depth, longer levels. There are less levels than Streets 2, but again, much longer, more in-depth levels, and you'll be in these levels a lot longer than you were in any levels in Streets of Rage 2, and while this initially sounded cool, I was like, oh cool, longer levels where they get to really flesh out the area, I quickly realized that I actually do prefer how Streets 2 does it. I'd much rather be moving from level to level than stuck in some of these levels for a long time, especially how each level tries to have kind of its own gimmick, and I don't really like a lot of these gimmicks. In fact, I really don't like any of the gimmicks in this game. They're all really annoying and they really kick the shit out of your character. Speaking of getting the shit kicked out of you, this game is not messing around at all. You thought Streets 2 was hard? This game absolutely destroys you. It mops the floor with you and then throws you out the window. Like, it absolutely destroys you. Or at least I thought it was, until we tried the Japanese version. So yeah, on a really interesting note, if you play the Japanese version of Streets of Rage 3, known as Bare Knuckle 3, this is like the real Streets of Rage 3. This is a much better game. The version that the US got is just not very good at all. The enemies have way too much health, you don't do enough damage, you take way too much damage, and it goes on and on and on. Bare Knuckle 3, however, fixes just about everything. The balancing, the pacing, the controls, Axel is wearing his correct shirt and makes the correct noises, the music's way better. Yeah, it's not even close. Bare Knuckle 3 is way better than Streets of Rage 3. Most Sega Genesis collections, though, let you switch between the versions, like the one on Steam that I was playing let you do. So yeah, Bare Knuckle 3 is much better than Streets 3, and Streets of Rage 3, though, as a whole, it's still a good beat 'em up, don't get me wrong. And it does do things that are better than Streets 2, but I just feel like it's not as good of a game as Streets 2. And then with that whole region difference thing, yeah, no, I just don't think it's as good as Streets 2, with longer levels that I don't like as much, and a lot of annoying enemies and some annoying ass boss fights. Yeah, I just think that it's slightly under Streets 2. And speaking of Streets of Rage 2, here we have Streets of Rage 2 in the number 2 spot. Now, over the years, I'd really heard a lot of great things about Streets 2, especially back in like the 2010s when people were reminiscing about best Genesis games, and I'd never tried it until recently, but after finally playing it, I was like, oh yeah, this is really good. This is definitely one of the better beat 'em ups that I've played in my life, and it is a very fun time. The game just looks at the original Streets and just is a massive improvement across the board, and basically improves every single thing with the original game to just make it an incredible time. The controls are not stiff at all, the game controls great, it feels great, it's awesome to just beat the absolute piss out of people as always, and it's really satisfying. There's a lot of combos you can do grapples, you can do special moves, like, it really is a lot better, and it's a lot more in depth, and fighting these enemies is never not super fun. The game is a hell of a lot more challenging than the original game. It really will test you and your friend if you're playing co-op, and these enemies have no problem just absolutely wiping the floor with you as well, but it's nowhere near as hard as Streets 3 American version. It is a fair challenge. The game does have a story about Mr. X coming back and exacting his revenge and all his corruptionness, I guess, and the game does take place over 8 levels. All 8 of these levels are incredibly varied, they're different. You go through some awesome locations, you go through an amusement park, you go through a baseball stadium, you go through the jungle, and then eventually you end up in a Syndicate stronghold beating people up on an elevator as always. But it's not just awesome levels you're going through and kicking some awesome enemies and fighting some awesome bosses. There's some awesome beats here. These beats are great. The music in Streets of Rage 2 is pretty fantastic. It's some of the best music on the Genesis. It sounds great and it's really catchy, and some tracks really do go hard. Like, it really matches the theme and the vibe that you get from a game like Streets of Rage. I can see now why so many people have it in such a high regard. If you need a game where you just go around beating the absolute shit out of people to the point where they're just dead because you beat their ass so hard, there is not many games that are better at that than Streets of Rage 2. It is an incredibly fun time. All these years later, I was just still really excited and really having a great time while playing it. There's no reason to not really try it, especially with how cheap it is. And as great as it is though, I think it's not the best. No, I think the very best of the series is Streets of Rage 4. And you know, you could go, oh, there's like a 26-year difference between 3 and 4. Of course, Streets of Rage 4 is going to be the best, but how many times have we seen a modern interpretation or reboot or a series coming back in modern day and it's nowhere near as good as the original? No, Streets of Rage 4 is just as good as Streets of Rage 2 and slightly better in my opinion. Only slightly though. It is still a fantastic game, and Streets of Rage 4, yeah, what a great game. Again, because it's a modern video game, it's going to have a lot of modern sensibilities that didn't exist back when the originals came out, so like the controls are going to be the best of the whole series. They're not even close to stiff, they feel super fluid, inputting combos is great, and anything to do with the controls is, in my opinion, the best of all the games. All of the characters feel incredibly unique. There's a couple different ones here, more than just Axel, and all of the combos they have, again, incredibly unique. They're all different to input, and inputting them all feels really great. It feels much more like a fighting game than the old games ever did, which the old games did have a dual mode, which was kind of like a fighting game, but yeah, no, this feels really like a fighting game, and it is legit. And then when it comes to everything else, they clearly took inspiration from Streets 2. All the combos, all the enemies, all the bosses, they're all very similar to Streets 2. They're all just great, and they all do pose a challenge. This game is not messing around. Streets 4 is just as hard as 2 and 3 was. Well, bare knuckle 3. You go through a ton of different levels. There is a bunch of variety here. You go through way more levels than Streets 2 and 3 ever had. The game is significantly longer than 2 and 3. Like, it is a couple hours long, which is, again, longer than the old games. And it goes on, and it's great. The pacing is great. The levels are great. I really don't have much to complain about with them at all. The game has an absolute ton of unlockables here. There's a bunch of characters to unlock. There's really just a bunch of stuff to unlock in this game. You will be playing through this game more than once if you really want to try to get even half the stuff. I really do like the unlockables and the extras. It really is great. The game has a completely different presentation from the old games, and I know that some people probably prefer the old games and how they look. Well, I got good news for you if you don't already know. You can play with the old sprites, you can play even with old music if you want. You can have that original chunky blocky Axel sprite if you want, or you can have the new updated look. I actually really do like how the game looks. I love the art style. The game is super smooth no matter how many enemies are on screen. And then, of course, we have that soundtrack. Streets of Rage 4 has, in my opinion, the best beat-em-up soundtrack maybe ever. It's my favorite of the Streets. The only one that's close to it is maybe like Turtles in Time. That one's really good. But Streets of Rage 4, the soundtrack is just an absolute bop. It's a beat, it's a slap, it's every great word you can think of to describe a soundtrack. I only have the best praise for Streets of Rage 4's soundtrack. It's pretty incredible that Streets came back after so long and the series is still as good as it was, if not the very best that it's ever been. Like, when does that ever happen? But regardless, Streets 4, I have nothing but very high praise and can only give it my highest recommendation. If you like beat 'em up games, this is the game for you. Like, this is the very best of the beat 'em ups. There doesn't get any better beat 'em ups than Streets 2 and 4. I mean, Scott Pilgrim's great. Again, Turtles in Time is great and all, but Streets 4 really might be my favorite beat 'em up ever made. I'd be really surprised if like anything tops it, and I'd be really surprised if we even get a Streets of Rage 5. I mean, the rumor is that there's a Streets of Rage movie coming out in the future, so maybe we could get a 5, but yeah, Streets 4, absolutely fantastic. Nothing but the highest praise. What a good series of beat 'em ups. Like, it didn't drag on and on. It was just good to begin with. It got even better. It stayed pretty good and then disappeared. And then when it came back all these years later, oh, it's the best. But yeah, Streets 4, very good game. That's it for this video. Absolutely recommend. Let me know your favorite below. And yeah, like, share, sub, all that good stuff. If you made it to this part of the video, say bricks in the comments. I hope everyone stays safe. See ya.